Hi everyone, welcome. Just gonna wait a few moments as people are coming in. All right. Hi everyone, and welcome to the sixth and last event in this Building World Class Team series of the year. This is all about building a resilient, inclusive culture that scales up along with your organization. Now, before we kick off, as usual, I'd like to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way first. This webinar is being recorded. Captions are available throughout the webinar. If you'd like to enable them, there should be an option on the bottom tab or in the menu by clicking the three dots icon. Chat is open, so feel free to talk to us or amongst yourselves. And pop a hello if you'd like. We are moderating it to keep this a safe space, so any inappropriate messages will be removed. If you have any questions for the panelists, make sure to drop it into the Q&A, which is next to the chat button. There'll be an opportunity for the panelists to answer your questions during the event, but feel free to drop a question at any time. I'm Adnan. I'm the delivery manager and data analyst at the Honeycomb Works. For today, I'll be in the background helping running the event. And if you have any questions or issues with the deck, please get in touch and I'll try to sort it out. With that out of the way, I'm going to hand over to Melissa to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Adnan. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Sabella. I'm the founder and CEO of the Honeycomb Works. Really thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you for spending a rapidly darkening evening with us, at least here in London, as we go into sunset. Lovely to have you here. For those that don't know us, the Honeycomb Works is on a mission for everyone at work to feel like they belong and are free to invent. We help organizations build inclusive and innovative cultures through behavior change and data, because cultures are created habit by habit, person by person. It's the things that people do on a day-to-day basis or don't that makes a place inclusive and safe for everyone to speak up, share ideas, challenge each other, and do brilliant things. You can have award-winning processes and the best of intentions, but still create a toxic culture that ends up destroying your dreams. Sorry, there's a bit of a downer. But we've created this digital honeycomb, and that helps people develop positive behaviors and also organizations to understand their strengths and areas of risk. So, as I said, we focus on habits. And when I say habits, what do I mean? I mean specific, observable, repeatable, achievable behaviors that you can weave into your day-to-day. One of the biggest blockers to behavior change is overwhelm. And New Year's is coming up. And so if you've ever decided to say, be more healthy with a laundry list of things that you plan to do, plan to change, you might know something about what I'm talking about. For those of us who have tried that and not been successful. But if you start with something like exercise once a week, you're much more likely to do something, make progress, see results, and continue and start to do more. So to manage this and help things along, we've organized the most critical behaviors into a honeycomb. And the reason it looks like a honeycomb is so that we can break down the most important actions to create a positive culture and to be high performing and help people work through those. So each hexagon or cell has 4 specific observable behaviors that people can weave into their day-to-day to make work better for themselves and their colleagues. We've chosen these topics and behaviors through analyzing the most relevant research, the most solid existing evidence, as well as doing a ton of research with founders and startups and scale-ups in the engineering space. As Adnan mentioned, this is our 6th Building World-Class Teams event, and we've covered a few cells already in the previous one. So we've made quite a lot of progress on our honeycomb here. And today we're going to be looking at 2 more, which we will talk about shortly. Now, you'll notice that we say completed cells, and that's not really accurate. They aren't completed until you actually put them into practice. And performing them 80% of the time. Yeah, maybe 90, 95% of the time, ideally. But once you weave them into your day-to-day, that's when we consider a sell completed for someone. So our Culture Plus platform is designed to help you do just that. It helps people develop these positive habits and helps them understand their biggest areas of risk as well as their strengths and what they're doing really, really well. So if you want some support to weave these behaviors into your culture, we'll share more ways of learning about Culture Plus at the end. But before we go any further, now that you've learned a little bit about us, we'd love to learn a bit about you. So we're going to pop a couple of polls up, but please feel free to say hi in the chat. And we hope to get your participation and perspectives throughout. Post any questions, as Adnan said, in the Q&A function in Zoom. But in the meantime, we've got a few questions for you that we'd love your answers to, and it'll just help us make sure that we're tailoring the discussion to you specifically, what you need, where you are, what you're looking for. And one of the key questions there that we have at the end is, what's the burning question that brought you here? And for that one, we'd like you to answer that in either the chat or in the Q&A. Just be aware that the chat isn't anonymous. So if you do want to be anonymous, you can either send a direct message just to the hosts and the panelists, or post it in the Q&A button at the bottom as an anonymous question. So as I said, please add your burning questions. We really want to know what you are seeking so that we can try to deliver on that. And if we can't fit it into this webinar, it might inform a future one. Because while this is the last Building World-Class Team for this year, we've got big things planned for the new year. And we'll give you a minute to answer those questions. And while you're doing that, I'm going to put up our agenda for today, which also includes our subscription link, because we'd love for you to stay in touch. And actually in the new year, we have an in-person all-day Building World-Class Teams conference that we'll be hosting with the Royal Academy of Engineering. And you'll have to subscribe to get an invite to that. So please do. So here is our plan for the day. First, we're going to talk about managers and how they are absolutely critical, but also pretty unprepared to be your front line to look after your culture as you scale. We're going to talk about using engineering principles to design and build your culture, how to prioritize culture as you grow, and the critical structures you need to put in place. And again, I'm going to say, add your questions to Zoom and the chat, and we'll see. Do we have enough people answering, Adnan, or do we need to give them a little bit more time on the poll? All right, I'm going to take that as oh, no, here we go. So great. So we've got 47% founder or leadership team of a startup scale up. Great. Well, this is for you. Absolutely. Expecting to be a startup in the near future. One folk. Best of luck. Awesome. Working in a startup scale up, not a founder, but care about high performing teams, and a couple of people who don't fall into any of those categories. We'd love to get to know you a bit in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. And then in terms of scaling, 23% not yet, but soon, 31% scaling now, 15% an SME, and then we've got 31% a large organizations. And absolutely, a lot of these concepts will work really well for large organizations. And this has been a consistent theme throughout our workshops. We've got the majority of people who sign up for these webinars who feel like their team is doing well and they want to keep it that way. So well done you for being proactive. But we've got 36% who are seeing some cracks and needing to fix it. Nobody who's deep in trouble. They might be too busy trying to put out fires to join our webinar. Maybe they'll watch the recording at some point. And other, again, we'd love to share in the chat. And then let's see our spread of, is it a defined culture or just vibes? Lots of folks on, let's see, we've got on the strongly defined. We've got two people, so we've got probably about 50-50 on each half of that. So that's great. And yeah, we'd love for you to share those questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So please go ahead and do that. Looks like we've got a couple of things coming into the Q&A, which is fantastic. So thank you very much, folks, for participating in that. Really super helpful. And I think one of the things that we want to talk about is why are we actually here? Why do we need to talk about this? And one of the most common things we hear, I saw this when you look at a lot of the charts on startups and scale ups, you see this very linear process, right? You see something that really just flows through. But I think our panel of experts knows that this is not the case. This is not actually how life is. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So I think James, as the someone who's in a scaling startup, you know very well how things are. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm James. I'm the VP of Operations and Product Owner at MFX, and we're creating bioreactors, hardware and software for cell and gene therapy applications. And yeah, we've been on our journey for about 5 years now. So definitely a lot of lessons learned and a lot of things that we've had to kind of implement. And I think this is why this is quite important for us to be talking about, because Melissa always knows, I always say that, it's really hard to have breakthroughs and innovation without the right cultures that make people feel like they can belong and event. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. Pavneet, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Melissa. My name is Pavneet Khurana. I am an organizational psychologist and I support startups on scale-ups with all things people, culture, and leadership, all with inclusion at the core. And the sort of the core of my work is to make sure that organizations are able to scale successfully. So hopefully I can offer some interesting insights and examples here of how we've been able to do that well.
Fantastic. And Brian, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Evia. I'm originally from San Francisco. I've worked in Silicon Valley and London in a number of startups and operating roles, and currently I'm a fractional HR exec. I focus on navigating the phases of change and growth by aligning leadership, strategy, culture, and organizational HR.
Fantastic. So as you see, we've got a brilliant team here who's going to help navigate us through this. And as I was saying, if you see these charts on startup growth, it's a wonderfully linear, orderly process, right? You have an idea, you validate it, you get market fit, and then you scale. But the reality is much different. And just yesterday, this was posted on LinkedIn, and I think it's really important to acknowledge is that after product market fit, often what happens is you get investment, you do mass hires, and then you end up with a bad culture, inefficiencies, companies forced into layoffs. And what does that result in? Scars, low trust, low morale. And this is from someone who is in the midst of it and talking to a lot of people who are scarred from it. And what we'd really like to do is help you avoid that. And and back to that question of wanting to keep it the way that it is, and we find a lot of the founders we talk to are really concerned about that. We have a good culture, we get along really well. I'm about to grow my team by 50%, 100%, sometimes even more than that. How do I maintain my culture? And they're right to be concerned, because it only takes 25% of a group to shift a cultural norm. Now, usually I'm presenting that as a positive, in that if you have issues in your culture, all you need is 25% of people to embed positive habits to make that shift and make those new habits the norm. But unfortunately, it works the other way too. If you have a positive culture and you hire people and you bring people in without setting expectations of those positive behaviors or of what you expect, then those new behaviors, those new things that are coming in could then shift your culture norm. So that's it's a really important thing to think about. And I'm glad we have folks who are sort of at that stage and are thinking about that. If you don't have a strongly defined culture, and it's more vibe-based, that's dangerous. And this is one of the things that we actually did. We were doing a series of founder interviews, and in a series of 5 founder interviews, I think we had 3 of them just organically telling us we don't really have a culture. It's more of just a set of vibes. And so we started talking to people about that, and more people were resonating with this idea. And what that means is it's really easy to shift, like changes, the vibe can change really quickly. If you've ever been at a party or an event or something like that where the vibe change has happened, you can see that that's something that happens really, really suddenly. And we know that if there's anything that's universally true in the startup and scale up space, it's that is a volatile and pressured environment. So that how people are interacting with each other can change really, really quickly. I recently spoke with a head of talent at a startup where they really prioritize culture and have a leader who speaks passionately about the topic, and has made it a core part of their strategy. But he saw this quote and identified with it still, because even in an organization where it's a priority, it might not be strategic and it might not be clearly defined. But there's another question here of, are founders right when they say everything is good to start with? And we've been gathering a lot of data on this from startups and scale-ups, and pretty much universally, even the ones with positive cultures have found issues, found things that they need to address that would have become problems had they not found them early and fixed them before they were obvious, and then they scaled because they would have grown and become a massive, massive issue. So how do you get a high-performing team, and what does inclusion have to do with it? Well, essentially, we're looking at creating cultures of psychological safety. And what that means is a diverse group of people with different perspectives who all feel safe to share ideas, challenge, take risks, speak up. It's not about being nice to each other. A lot of times people think that it's about being nice, and this is where we have people talking about things like cultural fit, being like family. It really isn't about that, because you don't actually want an extreme amount of comfort. You want some friction, but you want an environment where people respect each other to challenge each other, but still feel safe. And the short way of thinking about that is belonging. And that feeling of belonging means that everybody does feel safe to share those ideas and challenge each other. So, and that inclusive culture is a prerequisite to having a high-performing team. So how do you create that? I'm going to go on to the first really key piece of how you create that, and that's looking at your managers. So as a founder or CEO or a team lead in a startup and scale up, you're the center of gravity, right? Everything sort of revolves around you, and how you behave or how they behave will strongly influence the culture. But as the company grows, people will be further away from that center of gravity, and other planetary bodies, extending the metaphor too far there maybe, but your managers will be this next sort of orbit around you, and they'll start to exert a gravitational pull to themselves. And so the pull to the founder is lessened. So these people are going to be a really strong influence on folks, and they're the people who will define whether or not people grow, whose ideas are explored, listened to, acted on, if there's enough room for promotion, who gets promotion, and also whether people feel like things are fair. But despite all of this, we rarely train them. Now, again, in startups and scale-ups, often you're giving people great opportunities. You might be giving them their first managerial roles because they've been doing great at their existing jobs. And so this happens a lot. But the truth is, even in larger organizations, we're pretty rubbish about training our managers. And even when we do train them, we don't really train them very, very well. So they likely, even if you're bringing in managers, have not had great development and support. But obviously, when you're in a startup and scale up, there's no time and no budget to do that training. So I want to talk about some of the behaviors in our developing your team cell, which are critical and whether or not you scale successfully, because you need your team to develop and improve, but also because if you don't, you lose your top performers. You lose your top talent because they won't stay someplace where they're not growing and developing. So let's look at the behaviors in the first cell. Developing your team. And the good news is this is actually a twofer, because it's not just about what your managers need to do. There are also really key behaviors that you as a leader need to incorporate. Now, as always, explain the structure. There are 4 behaviors, and we're going to start with the first one. The first one is I spend an equal amount of time with my direct reports. And now, James, we get some pushback on this one. Can you talk us through how you manage your team in terms of time and all that good stuff?
Yeah. So one of the things that I prioritize with my team is giving each person the time and the support that they need. So, from the onset, when anyone joins, I start by being really clear about my personal management style. And I tell them at the beginning that I value autonomy and encourage them to tell me what they need and what level of interaction that works best for them. So for some people, they like really regular checkups and check-ins, whereas other people would like to work a bit more independently. And essentially what that allows me to do is know that, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And we kind of even have a little bit of a secret code word where, if one of my team members says to me, do you have a sec? Then that to me signals that, someone really urgently needs to talk to me. And if possible, I try to drop whatever I'm doing within the next few minutes. And it shows that, I'm being really responsive and I'm there when it really matters to them. And I think one of the key things to underpin all of that is I make sure that we have a solid structure in place anyway. So we have regular group meetings to align everyone, but I also have scheduled one-to-one meetings with each person. So that way everyone has a consistent amount of touch points with me, but then there's also the flexibility for whenever there's any sort of additional support that's needed. So the approach is really to have both structure and flexibility. So having the same baseline for everyone, but then also having that additional flexibility to create a more supportive and responsive environment for those that need it.
Yeah, and that's what you talked about, having that core baseline for everyone. That's one of the things that a lot of managers miss. And the reason why we initially included this behavior is because the research tells us that people from underrepresented groups don't actually get as much time with their managers, which hurts their chances to develop and get promoted. And as a manager, you need to make sure that you're getting exposure to folks maybe who aren't as comfortable asking for help and still giving them that space to share their ideas, or maybe share a blocker if they're prompted by you, but saving that space and carving it out for people who want more time as well. So if you don't create that time for people who don't ask for it, you might miss the great things they're working on. So there's somebody on our team who very much likes to share works in progress, get feedback, co-create things. And so with them, there's more time dedicated to that piece of it. But if I don't create time or create opportunities for me to do that with other folks where that's less important to them, I'm not exposed to as many of their brilliant ideas. I don't learn from them, which is equally as important, and they don't influence my thinking and our journey. And what the other thing that we see in research is that throughout their careers, people might have learned that some folks, when they ask for help, are seen as being less competent. And usually these are people from underrepresented groups, whereas people from overrepresented groups, when they ask for help, might be seen as ambitious and seen as a positive. So people might just be trained not to ask for help. And that might not be because anything you did as a manager, but it might be something they learned over time. So they're really, really, really cautious about it. There's also this notion of high performance in the people who don't need it. I was talking to somebody who was at a well-known, fast-growing startup, and they said it was 3 months before they had their first one-to-one with their manager. And when she asked about it, the response was, "You're doing great. You don't need it." But she didn't just want to be great at her job. She wanted to grow and develop. And also, as an aside, people don't know they're doing great unless you tell them. Our lowest scoring behavior is praising people and giving them positive feedback. So something to keep in mind as well. But the really important thing is that also she asked, many people won't. And we did a webinar on feedback a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, a while ago. And one of the things we shared is some of the data around high performers and how they are likely to leave if they don't get constructive feedback. So absolutely something to consider. And not spending time with your manager, it hurts. And we hear that a lot from folks. So something to consider even for the people who seem like they're doing great and don't need it. Now, the second behavior is similar, and that's I provide opportunities for growth for all my direct reports. And this is another one that disproportionately impacts people from underrepresented groups. And one of my favorite things about this is one of my favorite behaviors. Maybe favorite is the wrong word, but one I think is most important because I've literally had managers put their heads in their hands like this once they see the behavior because they thought they were doing something good and they were actually causing harm. And that's not a great feeling, but they could correct it. That's the important thing. But they might have had somebody come back from maternity leave and thought they were protecting them from extra stress. And so while they thought they were being nice and supportive, they were actually hurting that person's career process. Now, it could have been very much that person didn't want those extra things, but you can't make the assumption, and you have to ask, because we see in the data, we see in the research that this is one of the things that consistently leads to gender disparity in leadership roles, because women aren't getting as many stretch assignments and offers of those opportunities. So this is why we need to make sure that we're training and supporting managers, because these two behaviors are great examples of how it isn't always intuitive. There are things that they need to learn and develop in order to get the best out of people and treat your team fairly. And many managers think I'm being adaptable, I'm being responsive to folks, but what they're not aware of is all the underlying things that are happening that is getting everybody to that space where that perception is that is the right thing to do. So we can't just rely on managers to magically know this stuff. Pavneet, can you help us figure out how to make that structural?
Yeah, thank you. People teams and first-time leaders come to us all the time with this challenge. People are leading differently, people are managing differently. How can we use that? How can we bring consistency to the way that we manage in order to scale well? And in my experience and in the work that we do, organizations that have some sort of playbook, a culture playbook, or a guide that outlines how we work together are the ones that are able to scale well. So defining things like how we make decisions, how we communicate, how we behave, defining the grounding for shared expectations and taking away some of that uncertainty that you mentioned, or taking away the distance between what I should be doing as a manager and what my team member wants, in some of your examples. So it's ways of working that are agreed and some sort of accountability structure for standards of behavior. So James gave a really wonderful example of the personal approach on how you manage your team and develop a structure. Managers may do that differently across the organization. So having some sort of playbook or a document where agreed norms are developed is a wonderful way to do that. So that could look like examples of desired behaviors, what they look like in practice, as I mentioned, how we communicate, how we ask for help in reference to your answer, how we normalize asking for help, how we approach growth conversations, giving example of what an agenda for a conversation could look like, ensuring that some of those conversations go beyond the task and into sort of that individualized approach to development. So it's sort of, I talk about the concept of a playbook because it really is a guide, not a rule book, but a guidebook that gives a framework or parameters for managers who don't have the time for training, who don't have the consistent instinct or the experience on how to do that well. It's sort of the baseline. And so what the organization is saying when creating a guide like that is that these are the methods and behaviors that we want you to adopt because we know that they're representing the culture that we're building, or it's representing some consistency across our organization. And to reference something that you said a moment ago, Melissa, around not just defaulting to vibes, it's actually giving some sort of reinforcement to the behaviors and methods that we believe to be successful. And so and learning from those managers who do it well and who have the experience, and turning them into norms. And often when we don't have that written accountability, we do go off and follow the vibe, as opposed to developing a shared approach for how we manage and how we offer space in the right way to our teams. So I'm a big fan of a playbook, and they look differently in every organization, but asking the right set of questions to design that can make something quite unique for your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Culture Plus was part of that idea of helping people create that structure, and can almost be used as a playbook as well, but something that has that set of norms, behaviors, and things that are guidance, I think is really important to have in place, whether you use something simple to implement like Culture Plus, or develop your own playbook, whichever one fits in with what you do. But James, can you talk a little bit about what happens when this isn't consistent in an organization?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at those individual behaviors and the interactions, especially when scaling, because when you have regular touch points and structured processes and clear expectations, it's not just about efficiency. It actually helps to prevent issues arising as the team grows, because everyone operates within a cohesive structure. So you avoid situations, exactly as Pavneet was bringing up, where you have different ways of doing things. Obviously, there has to be some creative liberty and a personal touch to it, but you want to ensure that there's a general norm that comes out of that playbook. So it's important, because without that alignment, there's a risk of people feeling disconnected and othered. And also they feel like they don't really belong, because they see different things happening in different groups. And I think without that sense of unity, when you have new people coming in as you're scaling, it develops this new team versus old team dynamic, which can really affect morale and actually cohesion of what you're trying to build and scale up, right? So you have these silos and these fractures happening. So I think establishing structure and communicating clearly helps to create inclusive cultures that makes everyone feel like they're part of the same team from day one. And tools like the Culture Plus platform can be incredibly useful in getting insights on how well you're doing that. And what I love about it is it's data-driven, and you can look at how you were 6 months ago to where you are now, and that's a really good indicator as to how you're performing in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what the thing you talked about, where people feel othered if they don't really understand why people are being treated differently, is so important. It might be perfectly logical in your head about why somebody's getting a little bit more attention or not, but to somebody who's not in your head, they don't see it. And again, they might not be the type of person who's going to ask you about it. They might just internalize it. So two very important behaviors to ensure everyone feels respected and you have a channel to support them and benefit from their ideas. We actually have a playbook for you that we are making freely available to help you with these specific behaviors if you wanted to go and try and put those in practice. So I think Adnan's going to share the link for you now. But it has some tools in there, references to these behaviors, and some other tools we'll talk you through in a bit. But the next behavior we have in this cell is about letting go and encouraging your team to make decisions themselves rather than telling them what to do. And I think this is one of the other areas that is really important as you scale. As founders or leaders in a small organization, you might be used to making all the key decisions for everything, and for everything to go through you, and you probably actually really care very deeply about everything that goes out the door with your company's brand on it. But you can't keep doing that as you scale. And it's one of the things we've seen countless cases where the founder, MD, CEO has to be across everything, and not only will they burn out, and slow down progress, but you'll also get a team that's disengaged because they'll feel like they aren't trusted. So this is a really, really important one for both your managers and also founders and leaders to make sure that they're putting into practice. And then our last behavior is about checking in with people and asking them how you can improve as a leader. And I think these questions are really important, especially in places where things are good, because people might not be thinking about that on a daily basis. They might not, even if they are comfortable having a difficult conversation with you or giving negative feedback or constructive feedback to somebody who's above them and has the power of their career and salary and growth in their hands. They might not be thinking about it, but when you ask the question, it prompts them to think about it, and you'll find out things that you might not have found out otherwise. And again, find out about them before they become an issue. And it might feel vulnerable, but it actually shows people that you're confident enough and care enough to ask for that critical feedback, and it models really good behavior about developing yourself and being open to that feedback. Now, that brings us to our next cell and Brian's perspective on prioritizing your culture as you grow. And before I turn over to Brian, I'm just going to remind everyone to add your questions. I see we've got one coming in. Thank you very much. But we want to make sure that we address what your burning questions are. So do please add them into the chat or the Q&A function. And Brian, over to you.
Sure. I'm going to pick up on a theme that Pavni talked about when with this discussion of tools and playbooks and ways of working, and you talked about designing all of this. And I think this is where most startups, as they transition into growth stages, they lose the plot a bit. And I know I've been in this way as an operator. The first time I was in a company that had a lot of scaling and offices and people and products and customers and everything else, we lost sight, and I was the head of HR and I couldn't keep up with this. We lost sight of all of the things that were surrounding culture and affiliation and belonging. And so by the time we came out of all of this activity, we really didn't know what we had. And I'm reminded of a quote by Warren Bennis, which is that only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership.
Oh dear.
Yes, I know. And by leadership, he means design. He means intentional decisions. And this is all of the tools, all the insights, all of the habits, all the honeycombs point to the opportunity to make intentional decisions. And I think in terms of scaling culture, most companies don't realize that culture is that bottom. I mean, it's a relational thing. It's around how people are feeling in their relationships, and that's everything we've been talking about now. So the cultural degradation or cultural weakness starts because once the core group just grows a little bit over time, the relationships weaken, and it's not the same kinds of relationships aren't possible. So at 50 to 100 people, it's a lot harder to have the same kinds of relationships, and that's why you need the tools and the platforms and the intentional design. And you need this also because most companies don't actually start by defining what culture is before they say this is what our culture is. A lot of talk about culture is simply putting words out there that doesn't actually say, well, what is this binding thing? I mean, no one would actually say, no company would talk about product market fit without a shared understanding of what product market fit actually is. And of course, it leads to revenue. But in terms of culture, you need to come up with your own definition. I have mine, Melissa, I'm sure you have yours, and everyone on the call has theirs. But especially founders and leaders need to know, first of all, what it is we're defining, and then what that definition actually is. Because that's the thing that's going to bring the shared responsibility and the shared accountability for culture really, really into focus. And that's the thing that's going to ground it in something real.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that point of being intentional with it, I think really ties into the 4 behaviors around the prioritizing your culture as you grow. And one of the things we talked about in the previous section was really making sure that you define the behaviors. So being specific about the behaviors that you expect, and because sharing clear expectations for how people should behave enables that accountability. And, you know, and as you said, you often have leaders who think, I can still have one-to-one conversations with all 50 people, or I can see where their issues are with all 50 people, and you just can't. So you have to have something that allows you to scale that point of view, that view of your culture. And it does require that being very specific, but it's a pointless thing to do unless you actually hold people accountable when their behavior isn't acceptable. And this again is one of the things that we see so often consistently as an issue. And you know, it can be really scary to lose people when you're in a startup and scale up, especially if they've been with you for a while, especially if they're in a key role, a key critical, mission critical role. But I think the thing that we've all seen over and over again is, and we can guarantee you, is that they're harming your business. And to save them, you will lose other people. You will lose other high-performing people who are probably more positive for your company and your culture than that one person is. And sometimes we actually see this as misguided empathy. So a lot of times it's based on fear of losing that person. Sometimes it's worry about that person and looking after that person, but it's at the expense of empathy for the rest of the team. So you prioritize the feelings of protecting that one person while letting the rest of the team suffer around them. And so this point of holding people accountable for their behavior is really critical. I forget who said it, but there's somebody who defined culture as the worst behavior that you tolerate. And if people see that you're accepting bad behavior or behavior that is counter to everything that you said, that's your culture. That's your social norm. That's what's accepted, not the things that are in the playbook. Playbook is awesome, but you have to abide by the playbook, and you have to actually hold people accountable when they don't. So we're not going to go through the rest of these, but again, in the playbook that we sent you, you will have access to these and also a few more tips on how to put them into practice as well. So do go ahead and download that. Now, in the previous webinar, we talked about this concept of the circles of trust, and this is sort of related to this idea of the gravitational pull of the founder. And I think, Brian, you've mentioned that you think of that a useful way to think about scaling as well.
Yeah, I think this is great. It works on several levels. It works on the notion of time. In the center is the earliest part of the company, and then time is the company, the time that it takes for the company to actually be in existence. But then also in terms of complexity, usually things are relatively much more simple in the earliest stages. They get more and more complex, obviously, as things grow. And then there's also the people issue. You've got a small group of people at the center at the beginning, and the number of people grow and grow and grow. And we talked about this in another session around how the relationships will change, and often when the company is out here in terms of time and business complexity and people, the core team is still thinking about, and they're still behaving, and to your point about being fair and consistent, Melissa, they're still operating on this at this level, at this size, at this capacity. And so it's much harder for them to understand really what's going on around them. And most startup leaders, or most leaders in general, really don't embrace just how one of their goals, really, one of their core responsibilities is to be the context setter. And they have to be the ones to say, we're either in this context or this context or this context. And this is the reason that we're actually in a different context or phase. And this is the reality of it. And this is what works and what doesn't work. And they get tired of doing this because it can be repetitive, but the context keeps changing. And if the leaders aren't saying, hey, guess what, the context has changed, no one else will do it. And then that's when you start to drift and people start making up their own contexts. And then you get friction, confusion, and underperformance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, James, this relates to back to that idea of the founder and CEO and how their relationship changes with people as the organization grows.
Yeah, definitely. And I think taking that metaphor and also linking to what Pavneet said earlier about structure, it really highlights that importance of having clear and explicit structure, because I think as the organization scales, it becomes harder for the founder or leaders or that core team to maintain the same close relationships as highlighted by Brian. And that's why you need a strong shared understanding of how things should work, so it becomes a part of the organization's DNA. That's where that handbook comes in. So no matter who comes in, even if it's at this stage of complexity, they understand what should be happening. So ideally, the shared understanding should guide everyone's actions and behaviors, and almost independently of the leader, because I think the organization itself should be embodying and living the culture, whatever that agreed culture is. And I think when you have that, that in itself, I think is a strong sign of leadership, because you've done the job so well that it's permeated through the organization. And, you know, talking about managers that as we were before, I think it's then encouraging people to take ownership and to really internalize those values and that culture. And I think a good example of how this can sometimes be an issue is with ED&I in general. If it's only championed by 1 or 2 people, then it doesn't get much traction. But if it becomes something that's an intrinsic part of the organization, then it truly becomes something that's lasting and felt throughout the organization. And I think that's what we're aiming for when we're trying to build these cultures, is for something that is truly inclusive and a culture that everyone contributes to and also upholds. So I think that's where it becomes really important to think about how does that work in the different stages of that complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, people often ask me, like, what's the one piece of advice I would give, which is kind of frustrating, because obviously if it was that simple and there was one piece of advice I could give, there wouldn't be a whole honeycomb. But if there was one thing I want folks in engineering organizations to remember, my advice is to use what you know and treat it like an engineering problem. And I think, James, as an engineer, you're probably really well placed to tell us more about that.
So I think an example I often think about is when you're talking about engineering principles is quality by design. So the idea is to start with what you want right from the beginning, which is a high quality product, rather than seeing what happens and doing things as an afterthought. So with quality by design, we're going into the proactive space of quality assurance and moving away from the reactive space of quality control. So it's about weaving the values of your culture into the fabric of how you operate, so that it's embedded at every level from the start. So this is where creating that culture handbook becomes a really effective tool. But you need to have solid foundations of understanding how is coming together, and you need to have collaboration. And obviously you've got the team at the Honeycomb Works to help you out with what that might look like. If you already have something to kind of evaluate, you know, is it in the right sort of direction? But I think, as with any sort of engineering or product development process, that first step is really important, which is understanding the user requirements. You know, what do we need this culture to achieve? What do we need it to enable us? So we need to create essentially those user requirements. But then on the other side, I think in engineering terms, we'll then think about, okay, we've got a product, but we still have this need for continuous improvement, right? So the second principle that I often think about is inspired by quality management theories such as Kaizen, which is all to do with continuous improvement and learning. And if we take the adage of complexity is the death of progress, and also complexity is the enemy of success, but I will say and edit it to sustained and continuous success, right? And it's the same with culture. It isn't a set it once and forget about it sort of thing. Just as with a product, your culture needs to have continuous refining. As Brian pointed out, what works at 3 people or 10 people is not going to work at 50 and 100 people, and certainly not at 1,000 people. So as you scale, you need to keep iterating and adapting and staying relevant and maintaining your competitive edge, as you would with any sort of product. So it's always about asking, how can we improve? What can we do better? And I think when you have that sort of mindset, which you can take from engineering, it can help us to create and maintain cultures that thrive over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of continual improvement too, because just because something is working really well doesn't mean it's going to stay really well, or that you leave it as is, right? You always want to be constantly evaluating and improving, gathering data, evidence, testing, iterating. And I think earlier you made a comment about don't over engineer the solution, right? And I think that's where I want to go to as we're wrapping up the sort of the when you're a startup or scale up. I think, we see a lot of folks put in the processes and things that are really great at large organizations, like detailed appraisal processes and things like that. So we wanted to give you a bit of a lean structure of 4 easy things that you could put into place from the start. And the first, we've spoken about it, is define your culture with specific behaviors. Clearly state what is accepted, what is not just values, but what underpin those values. Something, and when we say, the reason we talk about observable is, at the end of the day, can I look back and say, did I do that? Not did I feel it, did I think that? Is it, whether or not you did that thing. It's that specific. That's what you're looking to get to. The next is feedback. Make sure that you have a process for that. Ideally, that it's anonymous, structured, and developed. People aren't coaches, they're not organizational psychologists. Leaving it open-ended and expecting people just to be able to guide each other on what they should be doing differently is a really big ask. So you want to make sure that it's structured and that there are specific things that you're asking questions about. Ideally, those behaviors that you've identified in the beginning. Third, making sure that you're measuring belonging and belonging uncertainty. Again, in a previous webinar, we shared some questions that you can steal for this if you wanted to use it. Or of course, you could use there's one in Culture Plus for those of you that are Culture Plus members. But this idea of belonging uncertainty is a really important one for places where you feel like the culture is quite positive already. Because it might be when everything's going well, things are good, but once somebody makes a mistake or things aren't so great or there's high pressure, then they might be uncertain about their place. And that's where you don't want people to retract and hide. And the last bit is hiring well. And when we say hiring well, we don't mean for culture fit. We don't mean to make a family. We mean following inclusive recruitment practices, because that is how you find the best qualified people. And that's how you build a high-performing team of people with diverse perspectives. So what next? Well, all of this is great. We hope you've gathered some good knowledge, but it's meaningless unless you put it into practice. So what we'd really like you to do is grab the playbook and create an action plan. The point of the action plan is that it's scientifically designed to make it more likely that you will put a new behavior into practice. We'd absolutely love it if you took one of the behaviors or 2 of the behaviors from this webinar and worked out an action plan and wove it into your day-to-day, or maybe gave it to your managers to weave it into their day-to-day, because that's the thing that's going to make a difference. So we're going to go to questions in a moment. But we're also going to pop up a survey to tell us what you thought. We'd love your feedback on this webinar. It will help shape our future webinars. It's fully anonymous, and don't worry, we're not going to put it up on the screen. So do feel free to be honest. You won't break our hearts right in front of everybody. So so please go ahead and do submit that. And we are going to go to your questions, but I did want to pop up on the screen a QR code for the next demo that we have for Culture Plus. That will be with the wonderful Eric Tomlin, who is, I believe, on this call. So you might want to say hi in the chat, but he does a great job of doing a tour of the Culture Plus platform. And that's coming up in December. If that's too long, you can always get in touch with us, and we're happy to book in a one-to-one. So now onto your questions. We had a really good one actually that comes up in a lot of engineering organizations, which is that it's a small company and there's a split between lab-based and office-based folks. So working conditions by default are somewhat different, and that causes tensions. So how do we navigate? It feels like the old new team point that was raised. Any advice or suggestions?
I can start this off by referencing something that James shared earlier. I think it's a really good starting point to answer this question. Approaching it from that design perspective, approaching the challenge from a design perspective. Often when we hear sort of gripes and concerns from people, they're coming from different angles, but getting everybody in the room to discuss what those challenges are, to really understand the core need of the two disparate teams is really important, and to understand why they might exist, why those differences might exist, and the context between them. Not to validate the fact that there are differences, but just to really understand the root cause of them. And as James mentioned, understanding the needs of the team is important to try and find the right solution for the team. So I think that's a really good starting point, just to understand why these differences occur and what impact they are having in a structured way is far better than hearing ad hoc concerns from people as a sort of starting point for any design process. James,
Yeah,
a lot more.
good point, yeah. James, go on. You're living this, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean,
Well, not necessarily that it's bad. But...
I was just about to say, you know, our company is exactly that. We have people who work in the lab, we have people who work in software, we have people who work in commercial, and it's very different when we were at the beginning, and regardless of what role you're in, we were in at the same time. And it's exactly as Pavneet says, it's about bringing everyone on the journey of understanding this is the value that you bring, and also, therefore, we have to operate in slightly different ways for people to get the most effective thing out of their role. So someone who does commercial, we can't expect them to be in the office all the time, because actually their role is to be out there. We work with biological cells. We can't build a lab in your house for you to work from home more often, right? And it's about understanding how we're all contributing to a greater goal, and how we're all playing our individual parts within that. And exactly as Pavneet said, you know, bringing everyone together, it's not about validating, but it's about having that open discussion and designing it together moving forward.
Melissa, just very quickly, Christina, I think you've got to name the issues. And yes, you've got to design a solution. You shouldn't do it by yourself. You got to find people who can be allies and resources, the people who are most enthusiastic about solving this. And you've got to name the different contexts, just as James is talking about. You've got to build all the tools like Pavneet is talking about to the degree that you can, but you've really got to name the tensions, and you've got to be able to call this stuff out directly, and usually simply by identifying this stuff and not shying away from the friction. That's the way to get through it. Every point of friction you've got to just dive right into.
Yeah, I'll add something onto that, Brian, and it's what you said earlier about all of this. All of this is relational work. When thinking about designing solutions, not thinking about equal solutions or equality, but thinking about equity, fair solutions, so that everybody is treated in a fair way based on their needs, based on the purpose and the boundaries of their work, as opposed to everybody can work from home on a Monday, which is equality. Thinking about the different levels of equity is a good way to look at designing solutions.
Yeah, it looks like the struggle is with people feeling like it is unfair, but yeah, I mean, I think are there other things that you can do for the folks who can't be as flexible? So are there other things that you can balance, and also I think potentially setting the expectations at the start about the different kinds of roles when you're bringing folks in, and so that they're aware of what they're signing up for. So yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that we've also seen come up a lot in the hybrid workforce as well, where it's wonderful that we give people flexibility, but the fact is people in the office have more face time with folks, and people who don't come into the office have less. So how do you make sure that you're accommodating that and developing other ways to compensate for those differences, I think. But we are just about out of time. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, for your time and attention. We really appreciate it. we'd love it if you could subscribe, because as I said, we definitely want to get you invited to that wonderful event in January. We'd love to have you at one of the demos. This is the group of organizations that are on the Culture Plus platform. We'd love to have you as part of our community. They're a great group of founders and startups who are committed to developing inclusive and positive cultures, and we're generating some momentum with it, and we're really excited about how much people are thinking about this and shifting their behaviors and shifting their cultures. So we'd love to have you with us. Do stay in touch. Do feel free to connect on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to the Honeycomb Works on LinkedIn, or email us at coach@the Honeycomb Works. But hopefully we will stay in touch and see you again in the new year.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We definitely need to introduce some exit music, I think.